This session is about governance, and it's the first of three about governance. And governance is a theme that engages Indigenous peoples everywhere. It is a highly contentious issue, as we saw from the discussions following Stan Stevens' presentation yesterday. It is a theme that intersects with all the research themes of CICADA: life projects and living well, livelihoods, food security, politics or resource extraction, conservation and protection, and last but not least, it is about methodologies. It is a theme dominated by law, by science, and by the limitations of international agencies in their understanding of the possible forms of governance. It is a sector controlled by numbers through intricate systems of auditing. It's an issue of ontological conflict, but also of cooperation and new understanding. And this is what our presentations will show today. So I will start by giving the word to Philip Osama, who's a PhD in geography from McGill, who's also a fellow of Stockholm Environmental Institute and the African Center for Technology in Kenya. He's presenting together with John Unruh from McGill, who's also in human geography and who's worked on development in Africa for a decade or longer. And their theme is the study of Conservancies in Kenya and Tanzania, and which factors in governance are critical and why. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I hope you'd enjoyed your lunch. So we're going to talk about conservancies in Kenya and Tanzania, mostly in Kenya, where we have a lot of experience. We've been asked to talk about two things. What are the critical factors and why are these factors important? We've identified about 5 factors which you want to bring to you up front so that you keep them in your mind as we go through our presentation. I'll talk about 3 of these. I'll talk about economics, security, and the issue of donor interest. And then my colleague, Professor Unruh, will talk about the rest. But just before, and I'll try to keep time, because I know time is of the essence. But just before I start talking about this, I'd like to just show you Kenya. This is the map of Kenya. If you can see, all the areas that are not colored are the areas which they like calling high potential areas. That means these are the areas where you can grow crops with rain-fed agriculture. And then all the areas that are colored basically are arid and semi-arid areas. That means these are the pastoral areas. But the pastoral areas have different rainfall regimes. So if you look at this, basically this bar here, the more humid areas are the green areas. So the green areas are more humid areas, so they're more agriculturally crop productive. And the less darker, the lighter areas are the very arid areas. So those are pastoral areas. So we have pastoralists in those areas. This is about 3/4, which means 3/4 of the country is arid and semi-arid areas. Now, the conservancies that you're talking about are set aside land by communities, local communities, for wildlife conservation. And we just started some work to start mapping these conservancies between the way they were set up from the year 2000 to 2010. And you can see the red ones, where there's red, these areas were conservancies that were set up in the 2000s. And where you see blue, like down there, these 2 areas are Maasai areas. You remember my colleague talked about the Maasai in the morning. So they live in this area, and down is Tanzania. So the blue maps are conservancies that were set up in the 1990s. So this is just to give you a context of what you're talking about. Now, I said I talk about economics. A few years ago, when I started doing work on conservancies, I was being asked why the Maasai, who are traditionally pastoralists and keep livestock as their main livelihood, would go into tourism, ecotourism, where they choose to keep wildlife. And I used a lion, for example. Why would a Maasai, and a lot of Maasai colleagues here would help us discuss this issue, why would they keep lions instead of livestock? And one of the narrative that comes up is it's the economics. It's the money that they get from it, okay? So economics is a factor that's very important. That's why we identified it, because money drives investment in land, and that's why some of the conservancies come up. So you choose to have a lion instead of having livestock. But then I said, okay, fine. The narrative is about economics. If you start looking at it broadly, does it make sense? And then I took two subnational units, which are counties, and looked at the tourist investment by local communities in land set aside for wildlife tourism, and investment in number of bed facilities for tourists that come in, and the actual visitation over a period of basically from 1999 to 2010. If you look at the red line, that represents the bed nights that were occupied by tourists, basically an indicator of the number of tourists that visit. And if you look at the blue line, that represents investment by the community over a period of time in terms of setting up tourist facilities. And what we start seeing is basically communities are investing in tourist facilities increasingly, but the number of tourists that are coming are actually not growing much. So it does make sense if you step back and look at it at a much higher level. Same as if you start looking at the land, investment in land, which is the green land set aside by communities. They had about 50,000 hectares in 1990 in these two districts. And then by 2010, they had about 250,000 hectares of land invested and set aside for tourism. So for me, the question is, where's the market? And this is a fallacy that we have to think about. Indigenous communities are being pushed to invest in ecotourism, but the market is not there. So it's something that they need to think about. The second thing I said I'm going to talk about is security. This is important in two ways. My colleague John is going to talk about security of land, basically land tenure. Some investment in conservancy is important because it helps forestall the taking away of that land by state agencies for conservation, by agriculturalists for farming, and by other investors who want to do development and so on. So that's an angle of security that John's going to talk about. But the other angle of security is linked to the fact that there's a lot of promotion of investment in conservancies as a means for which local communities can therefore help guarantee security, which is supposed to be the role of the state, and the state is not doing it. So you invest, you go to a community, invest in a conservancies, take community members, young people, train them, give them paramilitary training in the pretext that they will be fighting poachers, wildlife poachers, and then extend their mandate to start doing general security. And that's a big thing that's happening. So that's another part of security. Some of you may have read this in the New York Times a couple of years back. Basically, community members have become paramilitary people without a legal system and legal structure for guiding their security operation. The last part I'm going to talk about is donor interest. There's been increasingly a lot of donor interest, and the question is whose visions are being promoted by conservancies. This is a young Maasai kid, very like livestock. You can see he's a kid, but he's carrying a goat there. But we have a number of donor agencies that are putting in a lot of money and saying invest in conservancies. The only thing you could use for conservancies is wildlife tourism, but if you just invest in conservancy without making it a viable enterprise, what happens if the donors pull out? And that's the question we've been discussing with my colleague here, Mordecai. I'm sure he'll talk about, because donors are subsidizing these conservancies and say these are viable economic enterprises, but largely if you remove the donor funding, they're not viable. Thank you. So, John.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to talk a little more generally about governance from a legal and policy point of view. And the issue that I'm most interested in is the problem that I think is central to all Indigenous claims, which is that state-inspired statutory law only sees things in certain ways. And as we know, Indigenous law, customary law, doesn't really fit into that well. And so we have widespread situations where state law does not recognize the aspects and attributes and proofs and evidences of customary and Indigenous law. And so that disconnect is really a problem. So it's that interface there as an aspect of governance that I'd like to explore here today. What we've heard a lot about so far, what I can guarantee that we'll hear from now to the end of the conference, is all the very different ways that we can do conservancies, protected areas, land restitution for Indigenous groups, protection of land for Indigenous groups. Is it there's this wide variety. The permutations are large. And certainly last night's talk from our keynote speaker really made this point. The wide variety of very different constructs that are out there that are pursued really speaks to the magic bullet. There is no magic bullet. There's no one size fits all in terms of how Western statutory law interfaces with Indigenous claims and Indigenous aspirations for return of lands, protection of lands, conserving lands, et cetera. So the trick then is how do we go about this broadly? We're all here because there's a lot of work to be done in terms of returning lands and protecting lands, and we're all exploring ways to do this. So that speaks to, we have to tailor different legal ways to different particular Indigenous groups. And the how to get there part seems to be one of experimentation. And this is kind of the problem. So as an academic, I know what experimentation is, and my colleagues do. We walk into a lab or we walk into a field and we try one thing and it doesn't work, and we try another thing and it doesn't work. And we keep trying, we keep moving the parts around until we find the thing that works, right? And so what we've done up to that point is fail a lot. We fail in attempt 1, attempt 2, attempt 3, but we're also learning about what works and what doesn't work, so that at the end of our experiment, we have something that we feel works. So that process of experimentation, in many ways, is ultimately our problem. If we look at Indigenous law, it's also fairly amenable, fairly open to this sort of experimentation, trying this and that and being fluid and adapting to new situations. It's statutory law, Western-inspired state law, right, often provided to us by our colonial experience. That is much less open to experimentation, okay? That is about permanence. That is about predictability. And our problem is this. Whenever we try to come up with an arrangement for Indigenous Group A to have a relationship with statutory Group B or government, you experiment. You think what might work. Okay, and so you put something together, but on the statutory land side, it's about permanence. Okay, that's not about experimentation. Experimentation is I'm going to try something. If it doesn't work, I discard it and I try something new. Well, when we kind of tangle with statutory law and all the different ways to do conservancies, et cetera, it's not about that. We're tangling with something that requires permanence and rigidity and a specific way of doing something. So ultimately our dilemma seems to be that on the one hand, we want to experiment with things that are not really open to experimentation. It's statutory law, okay? So our issue is that how do we move forward, right, with this fundamental dilemma, right? Because we could all sort of boil our claims down to a couple of things, right? One of these is perhaps this relationship with statutory law, okay? It doesn't recognize Indigenous claims, right? Why is that? The claims aren't made in a way that statutory law is set up to take claims in forms of evidence, forms of proof, etc. It's all there in an Indigenous claim, but it doesn't fit into statutory law. And so we're again faced with this dilemma of trying to find different ways, But in that experimentation phase, which is what we're hearing a lot about these days at this valuable conference, that experimental phase gets us into problem because we think we're going to try something that works and it doesn't. And because we're involved with statutory law, we can't just dismiss it and then try something new, okay? Which is what we sort of need to do in an experimentation idea. So that's fundamentally a large issue. So on our map here, we have a couple different conservancies, particularly those in red and blue. Some are constructed along the lines of private property, others along the lines of communal land. So even in Kenya, right, we have different recipes. They interact with statutory law in different ways. Well, which works best for what group? Well, do we know until we try? We don't. And then we try something and it fails. Fine, that's experimentation. But if we're not free to discard that and move on to something else, we're bound into situations where it doesn't work and it aggravates and we have a host of problems. But what science likes to do in areas where it can't do this kind of experimentation is the favorite thing. Look what works elsewhere and take that and bring it into my area and we'll tinker with it and change it and have it work here. Good, but still that has limitations. We can take what works elsewhere and we can bring it into a certain area, and unless we really know how to modify it, experiment, right, it's not going to work locally. Because what we're hearing about is there's many local variations of how to interact with statutory law. So I view that approach of taking something from somewhere else and seeing if that works in your location to be fairly limited in terms of how to find a viable kind of way forward the first time, right? So it's like trying to make a guess at what's going to work and being right the first time. That's a pretty difficult thing to do. So getting something from somewhere else, even your colonial master who have a body of laws that works for them, let's bring it here and have it work here. That's a problem, okay? So even that approach has limitations. So in terms of governance, what's a way forward here? Okay, we see some experimentation on the statutory law side in a number of countries where they're starting to relax certain ways of doing things so that they can open themselves up to ways of Indigenous claiming and proving and demarcating and reclaiming, et cetera. So that experimentation is there on the part of the state. As you can imagine, that has difficulty, right? Particularly with those who statutory law works very, very well for, okay? And so that's there, but that's still an issue. But greater space needs to be allowed in statutory law for this form of governance. Of course, one good way to do that is to have Indigenous people participate in statutory law, right? So you can have those who are schooled in statutory law be very well intentioned, and they can guess what might work for Indigenous law, but of course they're just guessing. It's the Indigenous communities that know what will work within statutory law. And so having them participate more in statutory law, I feel is a large way forward. In Canada, we've had a recent experience here where I think we've had a higher Aboriginal vote turnout in this last election for Prime Minister than we have in recent memory. I guess that's kind of where I'm going here with this opening up of a space in statutory law to allow greater experimentation and input from Indigenous communities. The second lesson learned I see from our recent election is that we go from a government that has allowed for very few opportunities and innovations to take place in terms of how government interacts with local communities to, hopefully, a government that is willing to entertain many more options of how local constructs of statutory governance can interact with Indigenous law. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip and John, for this really interesting perspective on how collaborations, that's experimentations. Very good point. Our next speakers are, I have to find my papers again, let me have a look. Well, there's Colin Scott, as we all know, and Chantal Tetreault-Otter, who's the Protected Areas Coordinator for the Cree Nation. And their talk is going to be on land and sea conservation planning and protective areas in Eeyou, Istchee. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chantal Otter Tetreault. I am a Cree from Osano, north from here in James Bay area. My presentation is on Cree governance. An overview, it's going to be very fast. I have too many slides, so don't blink, you're going to miss some of the slides. History of the Crees, the agreements that we have in place today. I'm going to skip a few. We're going to talk about more of the recent agreements that we have in terms of governance, natural resource development, protected areas, and land use planning. So, can't really see it on my map here. This is Eeyou, Istchee. That's Cree territory. I put this map to give you an idea of the size of it. It's about the size of a European country. There's 18,000 Crees, 9 communities, and the area is 400,000 square kilometers. We're located northern Quebec, as I said. This is to show you more of the 9 communities and how they're set up in terms of their hunting territory. Each of the colors indicate the community territory. The lines indicate trap lines. To give you another sense, there's where my trap line is down here. It's about the size of Montreal. So some of the northern ones are really large, just to give you an idea of the hunting territory size for a family. In the 60s, before the 60s, Crees were nomadic. They traveled from here and there to do their traditional hunting territory activities. In the 60s, Quebec announced 3 major hydroelectric projects. There's the La Grande, which is right here, the Great Whale Project, and the NBR. The Crees at the time were not included in this project in the negotiation. They gathered and they created something called the Grand Council of the Crees, which consisted of the chiefs of those communities. With that, they had created an agreement with Quebec called the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. This was signed in the 70s. From that, there's 30 chapters in this agreement. The main chapters of the agreement are that the Crees were allowed to have special land regimes for hunting, fishing, trapping. So there's 3 types of category of lands. There's category 1, which is around the communities, which they have the right to administer their own municipality. Category 2 is more of exclusive for them to hunt, fish, and trap. Category 3 is more of a shared with the non-natives of the area. And within the agreement in itself, there's also the creation of Cree Health Board, the Cree School Board, certain economic development. We have our own transport system, and also an airline. So again, in the 1990s, from the 70s, what was being created was the La Grande project, which is right here. In the 90s, Hydro-Quebec wanted to create the next phase of their project, which is the Great Whale Project. The Crees didn't feel that they were living up to the agreement at that point from the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, so they had done a lot of protests and had this project shelved for a few more years. There was a lot of campaigning. They went to New York City, and they got support from many of the American states. Other agreements, there was in 2002 called the Pays des Braves Agreement. With this agreement, we saw that Quebec would not build in the full extent the next project, which is called the NBR project. They came up with another project called the Eastman 1A Ripper, where they would, instead of flooding larger areas, they would only focus on the smaller areas. So it was a bit of a trade-off that they would not flood as many lands as they would have in the original project. So they had a reduced flow in the Rupert River and would just focus on one area right here, rather than having a large extent over here being flooded. Another part of this agreement, of the Pays des Braves agreement, was there would be an adapted forestry regime. The way it worked in the past was larger areas were designated to companies, and what they did was they gathered Cree trap lines, put them together, and would manage it that way in terms of forestry activities. So this is what it looks like now. They would gather certain family trap lines and manage it that way in terms of forestry activities. rather than having one trap line being over-harvested, they would ensure that that trap line would have a certain percentage left over and not have it over-harvested. And other other developments that happen in our territory is mining. There are a few projects that are open presently. There's a gold mine near Wemmenji, which is in this territory here. There's a diamond mine up here. I think that's it. And there's other mining development that occurred in our territory that the Crees felt did not meet our desire in terms of sustainable development, and that's concerning uranium. There was a lot of uranium activities in the Mistissini territory up here. The Crees had felt that this was a mineral that they did not want to have happen in our territory, so we had a moratorium on uranium. So right now, we have a lot of protected areas in our territory, but we're still working on creating more. We don't feel that it's really meeting our needs. So this is the current status of protected areas. We have a national park up here. We have a national park here, and one that's going to be created right here. And the rest are biodiversity reserves. So what the Cree Nation did was, because Quebec was creating a lot of areas without the involvement of the Crees, we decided to create a conservation strategy. So with this, we're going to be, we had met with a lot of the communities and try to get their ideas on which areas that they would like to protect, because a lot of the areas that Quebec was proposing did not have a lot of cultural values or cultural areas that were involved. So we're working right now with Nature Conservancy Canada to do a footprint map and to identify these areas using GIS models. So one exercise that they did, just as an example, is that they would use a catchment area of at least 35% that was intact, a certain area target, and that they would include protected area network should cover 20% of the territory. Existing protected areas considered but not locked in. So this is just an example of what we're working with right now. So these are the areas highlighted with this program. It's called Beacons. These are the areas that they had highlighted that would be worth protecting. So another project that we worked on is called the Broadback Watershed Conservation Plan, which is in the middle of our territory, right here. It consisted of 3 proposals by 3 Cree communities of Waswanipi, Nemaska, and Ojibwe. And with that, we had decided to combine these 3 communities' proposals and have a larger one that's more regional, which is the Watershed Conservation Plan. And with negotiations with Quebec, they had decided within the green part, which is what was proposed, that the purple is what they would initially protect in the end. So it's kind of, our goals were not met, but we're still in negotiations with Quebec to get more areas protected in here. Another area that we're working with is with Wamaksu, which is the most northern community. They have an area that they would like to protect right here called Lac Bienville, and we're negotiating with Quebec right now in this area. And this is one of the areas that is slated for hydroelectric to become a reservoir during the first phase. So this is going to be a hard struggle for us to have protected, but we're negotiating with Quebec on this. And there's a marine protected area, which I'd like Colin to speak about. This is his project with McGill and with the community of Wemmenji. I'd like to speak about this one.
Yes, well, since 2003, a number of us at McGill became involved with he was then Deputy Chief of Wemindji, Rodney Mark, and at some point in our trajectory with him, he was served a term as Chief of Wemindji, and he's now the Deputy Grand Chief of the regional Cree government. He was supposed to be here today, and a snowstorm interfered with his travel plans, getting out of Nemaskau. So he sends his regrets, but he hopes to be with us on Monday. The project that we did with Wemindji predated much of the conservation strategy and protected areas agenda that Chantal has described. We like to think at Wemindji that we kind of pioneered some of that and prompted some of that development at the regional level. I think Rodney feels that way and is recognized for that work, because one of the portfolios that he now has as Deputy Grand Chief for the region is regional conservation planning and protected areas. And it's interesting to note that Crees have nested protected areas, parks, biodiversity reserves, etc., as strategic opportunities for protecting portions of their territory within an insistence on a broader, comprehensive conservation planning process, which includes all of Eeyou Istchee. Now, this is complicated in part because many of the lines that appeared on some of the maps that Chantal showed, she didn't have time to explain in detail, but just within Quebec, under the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, there are 3 categories of land. There are 2 or 3 regimes of governance, depending on how you look at it, applying to different of those categories. And Eeyou Istchee, the Cree's self-designated territory, is not all contained within the boundaries of Quebec. So some of those land categories didn't even apply, for example, to the marine space. The boundary of Quebec ends at the low tide mark on that coastline, and so there was a whole chunk of Eeyou Istchee, the marine portion, which we also have to make provision for. Of course, from the perspective, especially of the 5 communities whose villages are on the coast, it's an integrated world. And the idea that you should be separating the problem of terrestrial protected areas from marine protected areas is a pretty artificial notion, but that's the political reality. And so Chantal has described what's being done vis-a-vis Quebec, but then we have another process vis-a-vis the federal government and the government of Nunavut, which, when Nunavut was created as a self-governing territory of large majority of Inuit people, the Cree's customary territory in the old Northwest Territories, which never became part of Quebec, the marine part, was shucked into Nunavut. So it's jurisdictionally quite complex, but we have a 20,000 square kilometer minimum. We're still talking about the limits of this thing, but a 20,000 square kilometer proposal before the federal government. It has not done well, I must say, under the outgoing Conservative government. The resources of Parks Canada within the Federal Environment Ministry were cut to the bone. The political will that we had generated early in the process kind of evaporated, and so we've been taking advantage of the opportunity really to work with communities in envisioning what we want to do with this area, and biding our time and waiting for the best opportunity really to bring it back. With Rodney, I've just completed, and Catherine Scott and Geneviève Reed were part of this process as well, a series of coastal community consultations where we've been talking with communities about how, in their understanding of that environment, they want to knit together something that makes sense in terms of the land and their relationships with it, but that can juggle these various land categories and jurisdictional structures that you have to work through in order to get some provincially and federally recognized areas. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chantal and Colin. That was in keeping with the experimentation that we listened to in the first paper to find the right kinds of governance for these very diverse areas, very challenging project. Our final speaker is Lili Chung, who's a senior researcher at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And what I like about this session is the wide variety of natures and places that governance brings to us here. And Lili is going to talk about manufacturing nature, state, community, and landscape change in the modernization of Inner Mongolia grassland.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lili Xun, Associate Research Fellow from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It's my great honor to be here to share my research with all of you. And first, my academic focus is on the Inner Mongolia grassland of China. Just as the show of this picture, the red part is in the Mongolia grassland of China, which stretching over the north part of China. Actually, the Inner Mongolia grassland is an important ecological protective screen for the north of China, especially for Beijing. In China, in the circle of the environmental protection discussion, the protection of the grassland has a very special significance. The part in the center is my field work. We call it West Sunnis banner. West Sunnis banner is a broad pastoral banner in the central west in Mongolia, with the dominant part of the population being of Mongolian ethnicity. It is semi-desertified and desertified grassland. That it means a transition from grassland to desert with a very dry climate. And my presentation will have two parts. First, I will give you a very brief overview of the history of the second half of the 20th century about the social and ecological change of the Inner Mongolia. And then I will give more time about the eco-governance in the 21st century. First, as we all know, actually in the Inner Mongolia, in the Mongolia area, before the establishment of the PRC, in the federal order of the Qing Emperor of China, there are 49 banners under the authority of emperor. Actually, at that time, the central government only had a rough estimate, greatly divided on the number of population and the livestock of each banner. Actually, we can say the central government at that time have not a very clear view of the local community. Actually, the central government seldom try to intervene directly about the livelihood of the pastoralist. And then After the establishment of PRC, there was a big issue about the new state versus the old society, how the new modern state tried to get their establish their surveillance and their authority between the old traditional authorities. Actually, the socialist state had a very ambitious plan. It tried to rationalization of the natural resources management. From then on, the bureauization of the natural grassland management was started. What it means for the rationalization of the grassland management? Actually, the modernization of the pastoralism of China is a part of the modernization of agriculture of China. The government tried to transform the water, the grass, and the livestock. The source of the water was should be from the wells, which could supply water stably, no longer relying on the irregular rainfall under 200 millimeters annually. And the grass was planted and irrigated within the enclosure land, not changing resources as a rainfall. And the livestock industry was no longer the local herds whose quality was affected by disasters, but could stably produce and supply the national needs as much as possible under the technical support of artificial fertilization and breed improvement. And then, as you know, from the earlier of the 1980s, the China start its open and reform policy. In that process, there is some kind of decentralization process. In the collective age, the grassland was controlled by the people's communes, and then in the reform and commercialization age, the people's communes contracted out the land to individual households. And under the contracting system, I mean the household responsibility system, it built a new production mode. The mode is one single household settled down on the enclosed pasture, raising livestock, digging wells to get water, growing forage, and selling sheep for money. The cost of the pasture enclosing, well digging, and enclosure repairing, epidemic prevention, and fuel oil were afforded by the individuals, not by the state. This is a picture of the Sunnite grassland, the semi-desertified grassland, the herd and herds. And this is a pumping. The herdsmen are pumping water for the sheep. The herds and the livestock were drinking water. The herdsmen were feeding helimasic medicine to the sheep because the mobility decreased dramatically. The herdsmen had to feed medicine to the sheep to keep them healthy. And then this is my second part. what is new in the new century. I mean, I will talk about the eco-governance in the 21st century in Mongolia. Actually, in China, in the 21st century, along with the Open Up the West campaign launched in 1989, eco-governance became a buzzword in government policy discourse and academic topics. The rise of green authority represented by eco is related to the following events. Firstly, the strong sandstorms hitting Beijing and Tianjin in 2000 make the environmental degradation and the desertification in the western borderland a stand to national security issue. On April 5, 2000, Beijing experienced the most serious sandstorm, which shocked the public. As one of the officials involved in the policymaking for eco-governance stated, without such a serious sandstorm, it is impossible to arouse concern of the whole society. It's time to carry out large-scale regulation. Secondly, the international opinion of Green Olympics proposed by Chinese government in 2001 is a very important event. When the Olympic bid succeeded in 2001, every Chinese person could feel the national sentiment poured by this event, whose significance was far beyond its value for Beijing. It's about the national interests. So it is an indispensable color. The green is an indispensable color in the ritual of 2008. Through this way, the central government's eco-governance got its legitimacy. It is not too difficult to notice that the eco is just an abstract concept. The eco-governance means that all areas with ecological fragility or environmental degradation in the state vision will disputably become the target of the central government's intervention. Okay. And then the pressure of the ecological crisis forced the central government to quickly introduce a series of projects for ecological control and related policies and measures, such as the project for bringing the south of Beijing and Tianjin sandstorm under control, and the project for giving up cultivation and restoring forest and grassland. The central government provided an unprecedented increase in investment for ecological reconstruction in the Mongolia grassland. The central government's logic is very, very simple, and that is to quickly improve the situation of ecological degradation through increased investment in capital and technology. And for the local government, the ecological degradation of grassland means more trouble for economic development and serious poverty. And the investment from the central government was a good opportunity for them to transformation and development. And then the ecological relocation became the ecological relocation became the very popular policy in the local governments. The basic logic of the ecological relocation policy is as follows: under government guidance, guidance, the residents move out of the area affected by the serious ecological degradation, and then this area are sealed off for more than 5 years. No grazing will be allowed in this area during this period, so that the ecology of the pasture land will recover. And the former residents will resettle around the small towns where they will raise their herds in shells or covered pens, or take up jobs in secondary industry in order to speed up urbanization and accelerate economic development. 2 minutes. I'll be quick. And in the ecological relocation project, the pastoralists moved into the migrant village, were asked to change the traditional livestock livelihoods into the pens-raising model of modern animal husbandry, which was difficult for the local sheep to adapt to. Under the government's push, co-breeding became the supportive industry in the migrant village. The migrant village became a co-village. Firstly, the government purchased the cost for migrants' horses through granting interest-free loans and cash subsidies. Secondly, the government taking advantage of existing infrastructures in the project area to abstract outside investment to build milk purchasing station. Just as this picture shows, this is a milk purchasing station for a big dairy group in China. Its name was McGill. In 2002 to 2004, under the ecological relocation project, in Mongolia built a lot of cow villages, and the McGill group quickly gained market dominance in the acquisition of milk. But the core market quickly reached solitude. In 2005, the price of the cows purchased at high price by the herders permitted. So the dairy farmers the dairy farming become unprofitable. Coupled with cheap newborn calves, soaring feed prices, and dairy farmers had no choice to but sell cows at very low price, and some even sell cows as beef. Oh, I'm sorry, but actually, the cow village collapsed. But the ecological space was not used by the native people. It's still controlled by the local government to bring the outside agriculture company in and to do a lot of agriculture development. Yeah, my conclusion is, in the western region of China, local government is constructing a development regime centering on the territory in the name of eco-governance. This development regime encompasses process of urbanization and industrialization. And the development system from projectization project planning is not only a territory power practice. it is the planning of both the space and the person. And in the whole process, there is no voices from the native peoples. So that is why there are a lot of policy failure. Yes, this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lili, on the consequences of eco-governance in Mongolia. And now I'm going to hand the floor over to José, who's our discussant.
Al igual que los demás comentaristas, me enfrento a un dilema mayor, que es poder extraer ciertas ideas comunes de estas presentaciones. Y la verdad es que de escuchar estas presentaciones, lo que uno puede deducir de ellas es que en síntesis las luchas, las estrategias de los pueblos indígenas y de las comunidades locales por impulsar iniciativas de conservación, por impulsar iniciativas sustentables, son esencialmente luchas de poder. Si uno analiza las tres presentaciones, se enfrenta con barreras de los poderes dominantes en cada uno de estos estados que impiden y que han impedido o que han dificultado las posibilidades de los pueblos indígenas y de las comunidades, de los pastoralistas, de desarrollar sus propias estrategias de vida, lo que veíamos en la mañana y identificamos como sus planes de vida. En el caso de Kenia, particularmente, también Tanzania, dificultades y obstáculos de tipo económico, de seguridad y también jurídico, este contraste que es tan característico de distintas partes del globo entre los derechos estatutarios o los derechos escritos y los derechos consuetudinarios o tradicionales, que obstaculizan, ¿no es cierto?, la posibilidad de impulsar y desarrollar esos planes propios, en este caso las iniciativas de conservación de las comunidades de Kenia. En el caso de la experiencia Cree, también un proceso muy largo y muy relevante para Canadá y en verdad para muchos pueblos indígenas en otras partes del planeta, de poder establecer espacios territoriales y dentro de esos espacios territoriales espacios de autonomía y de gobernanza. Primero a través del Tratado de James Bay y después del nuevo Tratado, ¿no es cierto?, de la Paz de los Bravos, y poder planificar en ese territorio y poder establecer esas prioridades que tienen que ver con las visiones que el pueblo Cree tiene de ese territorio. Y en el caso de Mongolia, Lili nos hablaba de estas distintas etapas de la historia reciente del siglo XX, monárquica, colectivización y después procesos de comercialización, privatización que también han dificultado a las comunidades el ejercicio de sus propias iniciativas. No sería interesante poder profundizar en esta dimensión de la ecogobernanza que el Estado y entendí también las autoridades locales impulsaban, pero que más bien resultan en procesos de urbanización e industrialización, donde entendí que las voces de los indígenas quedaban rezagadas. Hago esta mínima síntesis para relacionarlo con el proceso del cual ayer Stan Stevens daba cuenta, de las luchas de quienes han sido desplazados de los procesos de la conservación a lo largo desde su creación en fines del siglo XIX y siglo XX, y cómo esos sectores excluidos de la conservación han logrado apropiarse de esos espacios y han logrado revertir situaciones de exclusión y de marginación. Porque tal como define el consorcio ICA y la Convención de Biodiversidad, la gobernanza es esencialmente, leo, interacciones entre estructuras, procesos y tradiciones que determinan cómo el poder y las responsabilidades son ejercidos en un territorio determinado. La gobernanza tiene que ver con tomar decisiones y garantizar las condiciones para su efectiva implementación. Y los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales, como señalaba y Stan daba cuenta, han ido utilizando estos espacios internacionales, fundamentándose y sustentándose en discursos de derechos y de derechos humanos y haciendo una relación entre la evolución de la conservación y de la preocupación por el medio ambiente con la evolución de los derechos humanos. Y eso ha derivado en la deconstrucción de los modelos de gobernanza con los cuales se nació la idea y las iniciativas de conservación que resultaron en la construcción de los parques nacionales y más tarde de las iniciativas privadas de conservación. Y ello fue lo que abrió los espacios para el reconocimiento de estas distintas formas de gobernanza en igualdad de condiciones. La gobernanza de los estados, la gobernanza mixta o compartida entre distintos actores, la gobernanza de los privados y la gobernanza de los pueblos indígenas y de las comunidades locales. Y cómo incluso ese concepto de ICA que pone en una misma condición a las comunidades locales con los pueblos indígenas fue desafiado por los pueblos indígenas para lograr que UICN reconociera una categoría especial denominada territorios de conservación indígena, basada también y anclada en derechos humanos reconocidos por la Declaración de Naciones Unidas, que reconoce, entre otros derechos, la restitución de aquellas tierras de ocupación tradicional y el consentimiento libre, previo e informado antes de su establecimiento. Y en verdad estas categorías están reconocidas a nivel internacional, pero enfrentan enormes desafíos, como los que veíamos en estos contextos. Muy sucintamente, para aportar algunos elementos, entendiendo que no es mi rol hacer otra presentación, pero para hacer una analogía con América Latina, que es el contexto donde yo vivo y trabajo, claramente los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales enfrentan enormes desafíos para poder aplicar estas distintas formas de gobernanza que les han sido reconocidas a nivel internacional y que se fundamentan en derechos. Y esas amenazas tienen que ver con la primacía aún de concepciones anacrónicas de conservación. Y menciono el caso de mi país, Chile, donde un proyecto de ley sobre biodiversidad y áreas protegidas recientemente presentado al Congreso reconocía la categoría de áreas protegidas estatales y áreas protegidas privadas, pero desconocida las modalidades de conservación indígena y comunitaria. Y como la gobernanza es esencialmente un fenómeno de poder, pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales a lo largo del país se reunieron, se organizaron y lograron presentar una indicación al Congreso, y ese proyecto de ley fue modificado para incorporar estas 4 categorías de gobernanza que UICN ha reconocido. Otro fenómeno que es común es el de la expansión de la economía global, es el del extractivismo, y claramente es uno que dificulta la gobernanza indígena sobre sus territorios tradicionales y aquellas áreas que se destinan a la conservación en base a planes de vida, aunque no sea explícitamente. Y en ese sentido, las experiencias de Brasil, donde el 80% de las áreas protegidas tienen algunas formas de invasión. Y el caso de Bolivia, que es bien dramático, porque Bolivia reconoció en su constitución, como se señaló en la mañana, los derechos del buen vivir. Y a pesar de haber reconocido los derechos del buen vivir, hay un caso muy paradigmático en Bolivia que ha sido la lucha de los pueblos indígenas de los últimos 5 años, que es el caso del Tipnis, un territorio que tiene doble categoría, área protegida y territorio indígena, donde el gobierno impuso una carretera para abrir espacios para el petróleo hacia Brasil. Y por último, el fenómeno, y con esto termino, del acaparamiento de tierra, del land grabbing, que incluye diferentes dimensiones, que incluye la transnacionalización de la propiedad de la tierra, y hay fenómenos muy preocupantes como el rol que está jugando China en África y en América Latina, concentrando propiedad de la tierra de una manera importante. Pero también el green grabbing del que se habló esta mañana, la apropiación de la tierra por conservaciones privadas, generalmente basadas en los estados del norte. En fin, los 3 casos que se han presentado dan cuenta de realidades y de fenómenos que son comunes a muchos continentes y que dan cuenta de que la gobernanza indígena y comunitaria y que la gobernanza sobre las áreas protegidas y sobre lo que UICN llama las áreas conservadas, ayer Stan Stevens nos hablaba de ellas, otras áreas conservadas, es un fenómeno de poder y que no está en absoluto zanjado. Gracias.
Right, thank you, José. So we're having some challenges with translation equipment. So I don't know if everyone in the panel actually got all that. Did you get the translation, Lili?
Actually,
No, okay. We'll just go with whatever we have, I think. Should we start in this end then with Chantal, Tetreault-Otter and Colin Scott? Do you want to comment on the discussants' comments?
Well, given the time,
All right.
we should just let it to the audience
Right.
if
Okay.
my fellow panelists agree.
Okay, so anyone on the panel want to have a comment to the discussant, or should I just open for the floor? Yeah. Okay, that's great. All right, questions?
So thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk. I have 2, I guess, simple questions. In the discussion of the flooding of the Wemindji area and other parts of Quebec, the word conservation was used over and over and over again, of course, but no conservation was mentioned that I heard of just using less electricity. And, you know, Montreal is this absolute scandal of waste and profligate use. And I think the government really needs to be held to court, you know, held to some reasonable standard there, and then they wouldn't need all these dams. So I think that would be useful and important in an era when people are getting much more aware of energy use. The second question is to Lili. I mean, I just wondered about the concept of eco-governance. It's used more, as I understood your presentation, it's used more or less in the opposite manner in which I would have expected it to be used. And I wondered if you think it's in some way fraudulent. You may not want to answer that.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm not sure if the first one was a question. If you can repeat that. I understand that you're saying that.
Use that as part of your strategy, that there's an enormous
That they
waste
should
going
not.
on, and therefore there's no necessity for all these changes.
Yeah, I mean, if you could look globally for the use of hydroelectricity compared to using coal or oil, I think it's a bit more green. Unfortunately, it happens on our territory. Same thing with, there's one mine I forgot to mention is lithium. There will be a lithium mine on the territory. There is direct impact on our territory, but globally, you'll see more maybe electric cars, more use of batteries. So there's a give and take on our territory, and I think we need to, you know, be all part of this global community in terms of that.
just talking about Quebec could use a whole lot
Quebec,
less energy.
yeah.
That's my point.
If I,
Yeah, I mean,
Different sources.
Quebec use of electricity, yes, we have incentives to use less electricity for sure in Quebec. It is hydroelectric energy.
part of the longer term story did involve the Crees taking a position that energy consumption should be reduced. When they were battling the second of the three mega projects that Chantal had a map of, the most northerly one, the Great Whale Project in the early 90s, there was a very interesting case made in collaboration with a PhD student in economics at McGill. I forget her name, but essentially developing a quite sophisticated economic argument that negawatts would be a bigger boost to the Quebec economy than megawatts. So, that was one of the elements of discourse. Of course, the Great Whale Project was defeated through multiple strategies. That was just one of a fairly full quiver of arrows that the Crees were firing at that project. And the much smaller project that came in the early 2000s as part of the Pays des Braves deal, in effect, one could see as, in fact, a much smaller scale project that had been won politically in the course of a 30-year campaign or 20-year campaign.
Is conservation deployed as a current strategy
By
the opponents of the additional dams? You can hear me, okay.
well, yeah, I don't know that. There was a movement within a couple of the Cree communities was fairly strong. Nemaskau, it was centered in Nemaskau, a dissident movement, but I don't recall that was an argument that was particularly made. The thrust of their case was that there are very significant environmental impacts that have been underestimated in this debate, and in fact they were correct. We have had this is another subject, but there has been a massive ecological catastrophe on a regional scale in James Bay and southern Hudson Bay that is largely unknown to the Quebec public.
Right. Lili, did you want to comment?
Yeah, and about eco-governance. Actually, in my case, eco-governance is not the real eco-governance or the eco-governmentality. Actually, I want to say, in my case, eco-governance just under the name of eco-governance, the government just do the business as usual. And although the words eco or words green protection, environmental protection was everywhere, but if you test the policy in details, we will find actually in my case you will find in the end the word ecological has been forgotten. The policy is real beneficial for the local government, the local environment protection. Actually, no one cares about that. The local government do not care about that, and maybe the central government really care about whether the environment was improved or not. But the central government can't control everything. And from my point of view, what is the real eco-governance or what is the real eco-governmentality in the context of China? I think firstly, just the scholars in the in the morning have talked about we have to listen the voices from the below. Actually, in China, the government is very strong. Nowadays, they really have a lot of money and a lot of resources, but the top-down projectization, the top-down policies really did not fit the local circumstance. So I mean, the real eco-governance has to give more space for the participation of the local people and listen what is their voices and to empower the local people. It's difficult, but we have to do this. Thank you.
Very good. Any more questions?
Hi. So my name is Felipe Perez, and I guess I have a question for Colin and Chantal and maybe other people in the audience. So based on this really absent the lack of communication with the federal government between the First Nations, and given that we have a new government here, that in their platform they said that the first thing that they're going to do is really improve the communication with First Nations, give them more self-governance. So, based on the map of the votes, it seems that the Cree mainly voted NDP. So what are your expectations with the current government, and do you see an improved and better relationship, or is it just words that you've heard before and are just being repeated?
The previous MP was an NDP. He is a Cree. That's not the reason why he was voted in, because the area of James Bay is probably half non-native, half native. He did win again this time. But as for the new government being liberal, the Prime Minister that just won is a friend of the Crees. He's been present at many conferences in the past, so I think a relationship with the Liberal government will be a good one compared to how it was in the past. Because we have a lot of agreements with the federal government. Some were respected, some were not. The more recent one is the Eeyou Marine Region Offshore Agreement, which we are working with the Aboriginal Affairs Department. It's working well in terms of that agreement, but in terms of any type of environmental agreement or environmental programs with DFO, we've always seen a struggle there to work with those departments, because their hands are tied in terms of budget. So I'm hoping with the new government there will be a change.
Yes, thank you. And we have another question here.
Buenas tardes, Celestino Mariano de la República de Panamá. Tengo una pregunta para la representante de gobierno de la nación Cree, para Chantal. ¿Qué se entiende entre lo que se refiere conserva de biodiversidad y parque nacional? Disculpe, voy a hacer 3 preguntas en un solo tema. Esa sería la primera pregunta. ¿Qué se entiende entre biodiversidad y parque nacional? La otra pregunta es, ¿quiénes son las que la establecen? ¿El gobierno o los pueblos originarios? ¿Y qué experiencias mínimas nos gustaría que nos explique ha habido al respecto de esos parques y la área de conservación? Gracias.
Thank you. There are protected areas, that's the global term for conservation in our territory. A lot of it is governed under Quebec government, the provincial government. National parks federally has a different meaning than it does in Quebec. National parks are run under Quebec. There are a few in our territory. There's a lot of money put into this for tourism. They're in areas that are accessible. They're areas where Quebec wants to increase tourism there. The Crees do see this as a conflict, depending where the area is, because we hunt mostly in the springtime and the fall time. Just recently, our moose hunt ended. So when you have a national park where Quebec is promoting the area, wanting tourists to go into this area, but yet you have a hunter trying to hunt for his family, for his community, and you have tourists, there's a security issue, there's a safety issue involved. So there's, these national parks are not in place yet. They were created, but they're not in place yet. They're still known as biodiversity reserves, which is what mostly we encounter in our territory. There's about 12 of them. Some were Cree-driven, such as Wemengee with McGill, with Colin. Some were just Quebec-driven. A lot of them are wetlands, which is great in terms of protecting wetlands, carbon sinks. So for national parks, there is going to be a lot of negotiations in terms of park management with the hunters, with the land users, with Quebec on how we can regulate, the safety of tourists and the safety of the Crees going there to hunt. And with biodiversity reserves, there's nothing there. It's just protecting the area. So we've been told by Quebec, if the community feels like they want to, promote activities in that area, fine, but it would have to be, on your dime. It won't be funded by Quebec, so which is fine. If we feel that we want to do ecotourism in that area, like cultural camps or promote our culture, then it will be a great place to do it because there's no development in the area. There won't be any disturbances in terms of, forestry or mining exploration. I think I maybe understand the second question. As I mentioned in my slide, we created a Cree conservation strategy. I can maybe give you a few points of what this entails. Provides a framework for developing a large-scale protected area network for Eeyou, which is our Cree territory, to protect our culture and ecological integrity. We don't see just protect our culture. I mean, either way comes in hand. Where our culture is more valuable is in areas that are high in wildlife and the environment. Approach is to identify and protect culturally important areas at community level. And that was very important that it wasn't a regional thing. It wasn't because I work for the regional government of the Crees, we made sure that people from each community were involved and to help identify these areas. So it's a long process. We just did the strategy, it took 2 years. We haven't really begun identifying areas or going to the communities yet. Cree leadership and planning, Cree knowledge, and land management systems are the foundation of the strategy. Incorporate conservation science and decision support tools, which I showed before. We did a project with Major Conservancies in Canada. We're working with universities to find these, potential areas, not just for cultural reasons, but for environmental reasons. So with that, we have a good relationship with Quebec. We're glad to say that. We don't get everything we want, but there's still a lot of room to negotiate certain areas. So we have seen some progress in terms of areas that are slated for protection, but it's still an ongoing struggle, especially with the Plan Nord, which is an initiative by Quebec to promote more development in our territory, but yet to also protect these areas. So we don't want to say Quebec's kind of taken an approach where they want to develop, and the areas that are not worth developing, they're going to protect it. So we're turning it upside down. We're saying these are the areas to protect, and you can develop in these areas. And another thing that we have in our back pocket, or something that will help us out with this, is that we signed a new governance agreement with Quebec, where Crees have more say in how our area is administered. So we have to develop a land use plan with the non-native communities for the major part of our area. But there's the smaller areas, as I showed, which is known as Category 2, which is roughly 10% of the whole territory that is exclusive to the Crees. We need to do a land use plan for that area. And there's also, as Colin mentioned, there's an offshore area, which is the Eeyou Marine region. There's another land use plan there. So there's 3 land use plans that the Crees are involved in, that they all have to work together. They all have to harmonize with the non-native population too, and they need to have conservation component in there too. So it's a lot of balancing that we need to do in terms of the stakeholders and what's the main objective and the goal that we're trying to reach.
All right, we started a little bit late, but now we're also ending a little bit late. So the other questions remaining, I suggest that you save them for governance 2 and 3 coming up. And so thank you, Lili, Jean and Philip, Chantal, and Colin.